Stand in line at any airport today and you know what's coming. Take off your shoes, remove your laptop, empty your pockets, and then step into that big futuristic looking machine. Arms up, stand still, a quick scan and you're all cleared. The TSA tells you it's perfectly safe, just harmless millimeter waves bouncing off your body. Nothing to worry about. Move along, traveler. But here's what I want to know. Is that actually true? I'm a consultant, I do some independent work, I fly for my employer sometimes, and in the past, I flew constantly, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Sometimes I had layovers and went through security 10 times in a week. And every time you do that, it's another scan. By the end of a typical week, I had more than my fair share of this millimeter wave radiation. And that's not unusual for business travelers, pilots, flight attendants, or anyone else whose job requires frequent air travel. Now, the TSA says these millimeter wave scanners are completely safe. They claim the radiation is non-ionizing, low intensity. It's basically the same energy level as your cell phone. And sure, for the average person who flies twice a year to visit grandma, that might be fine. But what about me? What about the people who travel more than me? What about the people going through these scanners hundreds of times a year? That's the question nobody seems to be asking or answering. Let's start with what we actually know. The current scanners used in the US airports are millimeter wave scanners. These replace the old backscatter X-ray scanners that were phased out back in 2013 because, surprise, people were freaked out about X-rays. I can't imagine why. Millimeter wave scanners emit radio frequency energy in the 24 to 30 gigahertz range. That's non-ionizing radiation, which means it doesn't have enough energy to rip electrons off atoms and damage DNA directly, unlike X-rays or gamma rays. Now, according to the FDA and TSA, these scanners emit far less energy than a cell phone. In fact, a 2017 National Academy study found that the radiation intensity is about 0.0001 watts per square meter. That's 100,000 times below the safety threshold of 10 watts per square meter. On paper, that sounds pretty reassuring. But here's where it gets interesting. These safety limits are based on preventing tissue heating. The assumption is if it doesn't heat your tissue, it's not harmful. That's the whole regulatory framework. The International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection sets these limits to prevent thermal effects like burns, heat damage, that sort of thing. The problem, thermal effects aren't the only way radiation can affect the body. There's growing research suggesting that millimeter waves might have biological effects that have nothing to do with heat. A 2009 study from Los Alamos National Laboratory found that terahertz radiation, similar to millimeter waves, can actually interfere with DNA breathing dynamics. That's the natural separation of DNA strands that happens during normal cell function. Another concern? Some studies have shown that millimeter wave exposure can alter gene expression in skin cells, trigger heat shock protein production, and potentially affect cell proliferation. Now, before you panic, these studies typically involve higher exposures or longer durations than a quick airport scan. But that's my point exactly. All the safety assurances are based on infrequent exposure. One scan, 2 minutes of flight radiation equivalent, no big deal. But nobody has studied what happens when somebody goes through these scanners 3 times a week for 4 years straight, or 10 years or 20. And here's the kicker. When I started digging into this, I discovered that most of the safety testing was done by the equipment manufacturers themselves. The National Institute of Standards and Technology actually came out and said, "We did not test these scanners for safety, and the Department of Homeland Security mischaracterized our work." Meanwhile, a Johns Hopkins study found that radiation zones around these scanners could exceed the general public dose limit. And that's for the TSA agents standing next to the machines all day, not even the passengers actually being scanned. There's another uncomfortable truth here. The World Health Organization's electromagnetic field project has essentially said, we really don't know if these are completely safe. Dr. Ivan Brezovich, a radiation physics professor, admits that while he considers the risk acceptable due to the low intensity and short duration, millimeter wave scanners may not be 100% risk-free and could have a biological effect. And look, I want to be fair, the exposure from these scanners is incredibly low. If you're flying occasionally, the radiation you get from cosmic rays during the flight itself is probably a bigger concern than the scanner. But for frequent flyers, that calculus changes. Let's do some math. The TSA requires you to be scanned more than 1,000 times in a year to exceed the annual radiation dose limit. Sounds safe, right? Except there are people in professions getting scanned 150 to 200 times a year. There are people that in extreme cases are getting scanned 300 to 400 times a year. Over a multi-year career, maybe an entire career, that's 6,000 to 8,000 exposures. And we have 0 long-term studies on that level of cumulative exposure, 0. Meanwhile, there are documented cases where radiation-based medical scanning machines operated by trained medical personnel with all the safety protocols have malfunctioned and overdosed patients. The TSA claims they have fail-safes and interlocks to prevent overexposure, but these machines run continuously in high-traffic environments. Software errors happen, equipment degrades, and unlike medical equipment that's meticulously maintained and monitored, TSA scanners are tested maybe once a year. Here's what really bothers me. The TSA has consistently blocked independent testing of these machines. When scientists from UCSF expressed concerns and asked to review the safety data, they were told the information exists, but couldn't access comprehensive peer-reviewed evidence. The Electronic Privacy Information Center filed Freedom of Information Act requests to get the actual safety reports. What they found was concerning. Federal agencies had mischaracterized findings. Testing was often done by manufacturers under questionable procedures, and there was no way for independent researchers to verify the results. This is the definition of trust us, and I'm sorry when it comes to my health, trust us doesn't cut it. Now, the millimeter wave technology itself isn't inherently dangerous. The same frequencies are used in 5G networks, weather radar, and even medical treatments. Some studies show millimeter waves actually have some therapeutic benefits, but the difference is dosage, duration, and frequency. Nobody's putting you through a 5G cell tower 3 times a week for decades. And let's talk about the efficacy for a second, because the TSA justifies these scanners by saying they're essential for detecting threats, except multiple studies have shown these scanners have an incredibly high false positive rate. Some countries report up to 54%. They struggle to detect weapons in undercover tests, and they're fooled by things like folds in clothing, buttons, and even beads of sweat. As of 2011, there hadn't been a single documented case of these scanners catching a terrorist, not one. So we're subjecting millions of people to repeated radiation exposure for a technology with questionable effectiveness. Look, I'm not anti-security. I understand the need for airport screening. But here's what frustrates me. There are alternatives. You can opt out and request a pat-down. You can sign up for TSA pre-check and go through a metal detector instead. But most people don't know that, and the TSA agents certainly don't advertise it. Instead, they funnel everyone through these machines like it's mandatory. So here's what I want to know. Why aren't we demanding better transparency? Why aren't we funding independent long-term studies on frequent exposure? Why aren't we looking at the data from TSA employees who stand next to these things all day? The employees who, by the way, have reported cancer clusters they believe are linked to radiation exposure from the screening equipment. The science we do have shows that at normal exposure levels for the occasional traveler, the risk is probably minimal. But probably minimal is not the same as proven safe, and it's definitely not the same as safe for people exposed hundreds of times a year. The bottom line is this: we're conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on frequent flyers and aviation workers, and we won't know the long-term health effects for 20 or 30 years. Maybe it'll turn out fine. Maybe the exposure really is negligible, but maybe it's not. And in the absence of solid, long-term, independent verified data, I think it's reasonable to ask questions. I think it's reasonable to demand better transparency, and I think it's reasonable to want actual proof, not assurances from manufacturers and government agencies with a vested interest in telling us that everything's fine, because right now, we're just taking their word for it. And I don't know about you, but I'd like to see the receipts.